Hello everyone, and thanks a million for joining me on another episode of Code with Lilly Code. We're going to be continuing with our coding alphabet today, where we'll go through common terms and terminology used in coding, which is really important because I remember when I first started, got a job in coding and even was discussing coding online with my peers. There were so many words that I just hadn't got a clue what they meant. You know, I had to go and research them and figure out what it was that people were talking about. So by going through these commonly used words and terms that you'll hear in coding, this is just going to make it easier for you. You'll have a few ideas of what these things mean and hopefully hit the ground running when you go to have your coding conversations with your teammates, peers and colleagues. So last week we went through terminology in relation to the letters A, B and C. And if you'd like to see that video, I'll provide the link in the description box below and you can check that out, where we discuss the terms analytical, the body tag and CSS or cascading style sheets. Today we're going to cover the letters D, E and F, and the words I've chosen are deployment, events and fetch, so a HTTP fetch request. And if you do like this content, please do like and subscribe, as it means the absolute world to me. So anyway, without further ado, let's get into this. The letter D I've chosen for my coding alphabet, the A to Z of coding terms and technologies, is deployment. So what is deployment? This is a term you're going to hear a lot once you get into the professional coding setting. So what does it mean? What is it all about? When you first start learning how to code, what you're probably going to be doing is using interactive code pens, where you can go on and plug and play code, answer questions, something like Free Code Camp and Code Wars, where it's set up. You go onto an online browser and you might be asked questions about coding and you give your answers. Then from there you'll migrate on to making your own projects on your local computer, and this is known as local development, or can also be described as local host, because normally when you spin up or you serve the contents of your local project, it's shown on localhost, which is the URL that you can view these files at. So when you're programming locally, it's all on your local computer. Nobody else can access this code, and you can't send it on to a friend in order to show it to them unless you use different services that will allow that to happen. But standardly, when you code on your home computer, it stays on your home computer. Nobody else can see or access that. Once you've got a little bit further in your coding journey and you want to make code that's accessible for anybody else to see, so like a website where you can go and access it via a URL, this is where you need to deploy your code. So what you do is you send your code to a web server. By sending your code up to a web server, anybody can now access this code, and this is what it means to deploy code. You move the code from your local computer to a web server, and the process of doing this means that other people can then access this code, view your project and interact with it like a normal website by going to a URL and seeing your code, and that's because it's been deployed to a web server. So that's the process of deployment, and that's what deployment means, is to put your code on a web server so any computer around the globe can access it, as opposed to local development where only you can see your code and other people can't access it by going to a URL. Once your code is deployed, you now have a publicly accessible version of your code that can be accessed by anybody around the globe, so anybody can go on and take a look at your code, as opposed to local development. And this is where you can still make your edits, you can still update your code all locally, and then when you're ready to, you can deploy it to a web server in order to allow everybody to see the changes you've made. So that's what deployment is. It's the process of putting your code on a web server for everybody to access it. Any questions about this, let me know in the comments, and if you like this explanation, please leave a love heart down below to let me know that you enjoyed it. And if any of you would like me to go through the process of actually deploying code to a web server, I'll get that video spin up for you if it's something you'd like to see. So that's one way you can deploy your code manually up to a web server. Just to note, you can also get automatic deployment of code. This is used in a lot of companies where once you commit or you push your code at a certain point in the process, so perhaps committing or pushing, Perhaps a Jenkins file can run. You can do this through Jenkins, and the Jenkins file will run and then deploy the code for you. It'll perform some tests and deploy the code. So this can also be an automated process, which is normally done in larger companies. It's not really necessary for small personal projects, or at least that's what I've found, but it could certainly be integrated into a personal project. Another option for deploying your code is something like Netlify. Netlify allows you to deploy static websites, so JavaScript, HTML, CSS websites, or even websites made with frameworks such as React, Angular, or Vue. They're all JavaScript frameworks, and you can deploy your code to Netlify and then go and access that code at a specific URL. So that's another option. You can also use Netlify in order to deploy your code and check out how it's going to look during the deployment. So keep that in mind as well. And again, I can do a video on Netlify if you like. Leave a comment down below if that's something you'd like to see, and I'll get that spun up for you as well. On to the next letter. The next letter of the coding alphabet, you guessed it, is the letter E. So what word have I chosen to discuss for the coding alphabet's letter E? Events. Events are huge in coding. An event is an action that causes something else to happen. So an event tells the computer what to do when something happens. And this something happens is usually from the user input. So the user will do something and then the event will fire and will go ahead and run a block of code that fired because this event happened. So for example, you could have an event that fires on key press. So when someone presses a button on the keypad, something will happen. When someone scrolls, something will happen. So any sort of interaction, human interaction with the page, that you would like something to happen upon that interaction, that's what an event is, and they're very common in programming, and it's a very useful term to know of. So that's what an event is. An event is the response to a user action. So a click of a button, key up, key down, scroll, etc. So now I'm going to show you a few examples of events with JavaScript, HTML and CSS. Well, JavaScript and HTML is all that's needed, but I also have a tiny bit of CSS wrote. So we can have a quick look at some events and discuss exactly what's going on and how it's all working. So let's look at that now. Okay, so let's get into what an event is in coding. I've prepared some code to show you exactly how an event works and what it does. So let's have a look. As you can see here from the project, I have an index file, my HTML file, a CSS file and a script file. So I'll speak through these and explain what each of these are doing. Let's start with the index file. I'll go through each line of this because why not explain it all? So we'll start off with the Doctype Html. When you're defining a HTML file, you just specify this at the top of your file in order to specify that it is indeed a HTML file. So this is the syntax of a HTML file. Then you specify the language, and you can have other things in here as well. This is a very simple template, but this works. So as a bare bones, this is the basic HTML file. We then have the head and the body. What the head does is it explains to the browser what is going on and the links that you're linking to in your HTML file. So here we can see we have a link, and this is telling us that we have a link to a style sheet, and the name of the style sheet is main.styles.css, which you can see over here in our Finder. We have our main.styles.css file in the same folder as the index and the script. Then we also have a title tag, and what the title tag is doing is this is the name that's put up in the tab when you open the browser. So if I open up the page here and show it to you, you'll be able to see this tab, this title in the tab of my browser. So we'll have a look at that now. And just to mention as well, I'm running this locally, so this goes back to my first word, deployment. I'm running this locally, and the way I've served this up is I have an inbuilt extension called Live Server, I think it's called. Yeah, Live Server, and I have that installed there. And if we have a look at this, what this does is allows you to spin up your code as you're doing local development, and you can look at these changes straight away. So it's not deployed to a web server. It's just being served with this inbuilt live server that you can install in Visual Studio Code in the extensions. And if you want a bit more information about this, I did a video on my top 10 Visual Studio Code extensions, so you can check that out if you want to know my recommended extensions and how to install an extension and what they're all about. So check that out for more information. I'll leave the link in the description box below. So here we can see we have it running on port 550. I'll just stop this for a moment and start it up again so you can see what happens. So once you've installed this live server, you get a button down in the bottom tab of your Visual Studio Code, and you can just click this, go live, and it will literally spin up your project for you. So here now we can see exactly the project that we're looking at. So in our HTML here, as I said, we have our head tag, which has our title, and here we can see the title in the tab of the browser. So that's what that title is doing in your head tag. And just to mention as well, each tag has an opening and a closing tag. And the closing tag is denoted with this / and then the name of the tag. So that's how you open and close a tag in HTML. You can see it's the same for the title tag. So some tags are self-closing, like this link tag, and this doesn't need a closing tag. But for most tags in HTML, you will have an opening and a closing tag, and the closing tag is denoted with this /. So that's what's going on there. Then we have our body. And if you watch my first video on the A to Z of coding, body was the word that I chose for the letter B. So you can check out that video for more information on the body tag, but all of your content on your page will be included in your body tag. So in here we see we have a main first level div, which includes everything that we want to see on this page. So we've given it the class container. Also in that previous video, my letter C was CSS. So I go into some explanation about CSS, but we can see here we have the class container, and I'll show you my CSS file now in a moment, and I'll show you how we access this and provide styling with this class that's been put on this div. So the class name of container. Then we have our 3 buttons. So if we have a look back at our server here, we'll be able to see these 3 buttons. So here we can see the text, click me to alert. So you have your button, you have some different information that you want to include about your button. So you can have an ID, I could have a class in here, and I have my events. So that's what we're discussing now, is our events. So here I have an on-click event on 2 of these buttons. And this is telling this button what to do in the event that someone clicks them. And then just before your closing tag, in between your opening button tag and your closing button tag is the text that you'll see on this button. So if we go back to our browser here, we can see we have the first button, click me to alert. We have a second button, click me to change text, which we can see here. This is our second button. And then we have our third button, click me to change color. And there's the click me to change color button. So the text is included in between the 2 button tags. And that's the text that you'll see on your button then. And then I also have this link to a script tag, which gives the source as script.js, which we can find here in our script.js file. And this is the script that I want to associate with this HTML file. This will tell the HTML what JavaScript to run on certain events. So we can see that now in a moment. So first of all, if I just show you quickly my CSS file and how all this links together. So as you can see, we had our container class. So if we click through here to our main installed CSS, the way we access a class is we do it by the dot notation. So here we can see dot and container, and I've just given some very simple CSS. I've tried to keep it simple to really hammer home the main point here, which is the events. So here we can just see some general styling. I just wanted to display flex and justify the content in the center of the page. Then, because this isn't a class name, this is actually just accessing the button. We don't need to do a dot if we're talking about the actual tag itself. This is not a class given in double quotes like this. It's the button itself. So for that, we don't use the dot, we just say button, and we open up our curly brackets and give the CSS that we'd like. So if we go back to our browser and have a look here, we can see we have padding of 20 pixels. So that's the padding around the text here in between the button. That's 20 pixels. We also have a margin of 20 pixels, which is the margin around the button. So that's the margin there that's given this gap in between the buttons. Our background color is blue here. So we can see our buttons are in fact blue. Our color, which corresponds to the font color, so the font of the buttons is white. We also have our font weight, and a font weight of 700 is saying make the font bolder. So it's 700, it's bolder, it's a higher level up. So if I was to change this to 100, the font wouldn't be as bold anymore. So we'll have a look at that. And now you can see that font isn't as bold anymore. So that's what that's doing. Then we don't have any border on our button. It's just a blue button with no border, and the font size is slightly larger than normal. So that's just to go through what that CSS is doing. I've kept it simple. So now if we go back to the HTML, let's see what these 3 different buttons are doing. So first of all, we have a button which is our alert button. So I've just split screen my screen here to make it slightly easier for you to see the code and the browser. So the first button we can see here is a button, and it has the ID of alert. And what we want this button to do is, this is the event handler. This is the on-click event handler. So even as we can see, if we hover over it here, what this is saying is that a pointing device button has been pressed and released on an element. So all that means is literally we've clicked that button. So what we want to happen when we click this button is an alert, and an alert is a keyword, and what this says is it's going to show a pop-up. So we want it to actually alert the message, wow, exciting, when we click this button. So that's what this button is going to do. Let's have a look and see how that works. So we'll click the button. There we go, we get our alert, and it says wow, exciting, because it is exciting. We're learning as we go here. So that's our first button. That's an event handler, and that on-click event has told this button what to do when we click it, which was alert the text, wow, exciting. So you can see how an event is working there. It's telling the computer what to do on a user input, in this case on click of a button. So we'll move on to the next button now. So the next button has an ID of change text. That's the ID of this button. So we've given this button a specific ID. The IDs must be unique, so you can only have one ID per page. And the ID of this button is called change text. So that's how we can access this button and interact with it with this ID. So we can see also we have a function call here. So an on click, we want to do something on click of this button, and what we want to do is call this function change button text. And we can see that because we have our open and closing function brackets here, our parentheses, and the name of the function is change button text. So if we go into our script.js file here, we can see here is our function definition. We have our function called change button text, and what this function is doing is it's going into our document and it's getting the element by the ID of change text, which as we've seen there's only this ID here on this button, the change text. So therefore with that function now and get element by ID, we can access that button. So we're accessing it, and what we're telling it to do is change the inner HTML to I'm Lily, thanks for watching. So therefore when we click on the button, it'll run the event handler, which is telling it on click to run this function, and we should see the text change to I'm Lily, thanks for watching. So there you go, there's another example of an event handler, and that's how you use an event handler. You can either have something like an alert straight away on the on click, or you can make it run a function and do another set of instructions. So that's what we've done there. We've demonstrated that this function will run on click when we click that button. So we can see there that it changed the button text. And just to go through this here as well, so what I've done is I've done document get element by ID change text. Another way to do the exact same thing would be to declare a variable, say change button text, and we can do document.query selector. And what this does is telling it what element to get on the page. So whereas get element by ID is specifically getting an ID, so we just pass in the name of the ID that we want to access. In this case, it's change text. If we were to use query selector can get more than just IDs. So by passing through the hash is another name for ID in programming. So this is how we denote an ID, by the hash symbol. So here we're telling it that we want to get the ID with the hash of the name change text. So this is another way of accessing that same button in the HTML, in the JavaScript file, by doing something like query selector and passing in the ID that we want and then the name. But I've done it in the function call by using document get element by ID and just passing it the ID's name instead, and then telling it to change the inner HTML to I'm Lily, thanks for watching. So now we'll have a look at the third example of an event handler, which is this button we have, which we have the ID of change color on. So the ID of this button is change color, and when we click it, it should change color. So we'll go back to our script and just see how that's doing what it's doing. So in here we can see we've defined the variable change color button. So this change color button is now assigned to document.querySelector hash change color. So this is saying get the query selector of the ID of change color. So get the corresponding item on the HTML tag that has the ID of change color. So that's what this change color button has now been assigned to, is the ID that contains change color. Then we can see with this variable, which is the item itself that has the ID of change color, what we're going to do is add an event listener. So on click, what we want to do is run the function. So that's what we're doing here now, is we're changing the style, the background color of the item that we've specified, which is the ID of change color, and we want to change the color on click of the button. So let's have a look at that one working in action. So there we go, the color of the button has changed. So these are different examples of events and event handlers and how you can use them in coding. I've done it with a plain old simple JavaScript file, HTML, and just messed around and showed you a few examples to give you an idea of what an event handler is and how it works, and some coding examples of that. So a great resource when you're looking at events and you're looking at anything really got to do with coding, I find, is the MDN web docs, so the Mozilla developer documents, and you can find so much information here on many different topics, and I have already pointed this out in a previous video. It's so useful. So get on to MDN and have a look. I will include the link in the description below for you to have a look at, and it's a really helpful resource. So check that out. And here you can see a lot of information about events, and you can have a look through and learn some more about it. So it's just going through some of the same things I've discussed here. We have a button that changes color. We're getting it by query selector, and the query selector is button. Then we're running some function, which is just, this function is just getting a random maths number. So what that's going to do is just give you a random number. That's what this math random function does, is give you a random number. And then here we can see the on click function, which is telling the button what to do on click. So again, we have changed the color and we want to change it to R&D color. So that's why they used the math random function up here. They want to randomize the color. So that means every time you click on the button, it's going to randomize the RGB values. And what that will do is give you a different color each time, because RGB just means red, green, blue. And that's how we specify colors in CSS. So you can have RGB and give it an RG and a B value. And depending on how much red, green and blue you have will determine the color. So by using this math random function, we're going to constantly give a new color each time you click the button. So your button's going to be like a little change in button color. So you can have a look at these documents. They're very useful, but hopefully my brief introduction has allowed you to understand what an event is and have a bit of an understanding. So if someone asks you about events, you have an idea of what's going on. So let's move on to the next letter of the alphabet. The next letter of the coding alphabet I've chosen is the letter F. And the word I've chosen is fetch. So what is fetch? Fetch is just an API for fetching data across the internet. So it's a way of retrieving data back from the internet, or from, you can even use it internally in your files, but it's getting data back in order to use it in your own projects. So let's take a look at an example of fetch. So the fetch method takes one mandatory argument, and this is the URL or the place where you'd like to fetch this data from, or the path of where you want to fetch your data from, the resource where you want to get your data. So that's the one mandatory argument that you'll need in order to get your data, is tell it where do you want to fetch the data from. So once you get your response back, then you can determine what it is you want to do with it. So we'll have a quick look at an example of fetch and show you what fetch is. So let's get into that now. So let's have a look at the code associated with a fetch HTTP request. So where we're fetching some data from a URL. So here we have the fetch keyword, and as I said, we only need one parameter going into this fetch, and the required one is the location of where you want to request it from. So we have our fetch set up, and we have the URL that we want to fetch this data from. Seeing as this is a promise, we then tell it what to do. So we can just chain on the then, the dot then, and tell it what to do. So we want to take our response, and all we want to do is return our response.json. So that's what we want to do once we do this fetch. So we're just going to return that data in a JSON. So return the response as a JSON object. What I've also done here is chained on another response, another dot then, in order to just console log out this response data. So we'll see that now in a moment. So down here then we can see our get button, which again is using the same syntax that we used previously. So we have our get button defined, and what our get button is it's referring to document get element by ID, and the ID we want to get when we're using this get element by ID is the piece of HTML with the ID of get. So if we go to our HTML here, we should see a button with the ID of get, because that's what we're telling this to do here, is get the element by the ID get. Now this doesn't specify that it is a button, but we've named it get button, so I'm presuming it's going to be a button. And if we go back to our index, we'll see it is indeed a button, which is why I named it get button. So if we look at our index.html here, we can see again we just have a very simple setup. We've linked our style sheet, our main styles.css, which is just telling the button to float in the middle, give it the padding, the blue color, the white font, and just the margin around the button as well, which is this white spacing at the top. So that's all our main styles is specifying there. And we also have our script linked, our fetch.js, which is the JavaScript that we want to link to this HTML file, which is what we were just looking at. Then we have our body, and all we have in our body is a container, so just a div, which is our container. And then we have our button with the ID of get, and the button's title, or what's wrote on the button I should say, is in between these two button tags, and it says get me the data. So here we can see our button with get me the data. So if I just open up my developer tools here, and then we won't worry about that error for now because I think it'll still work. Yeah. So once we open up our developer tools here and we go back to our fetch.js, which is our JavaScript that we want to run in association with this HTML file, we can see we have our get button, which is our get element by ID, get, which we just seen was our button, and we want to add an event listener. So on click, we want to run the function retrieve data. And our retrieve data function is our fetch function to get this data back from the API. So once we click the button here, and we can do this many times, we can see our response data being console logged out. So that's the name there that's given response data, and then you see the response data itself. So when it's in these single parentheses, it's just sending out the text, the string response data, which is this string here, the text. And then we have response data with no brackets, and you must include a comma here. And then just the response data is the actual response data that we're sending out. So if we have a look at this response data, it's what we're getting back from this API and /users. So here we have our data coming back, and these are our various users that are found at that test API where you can retrieve your data from. And it has other information. So this particular API sends back the page and the items per page and how many total pages there are as well. So we can see that there's total pages of 2 and we've 12 total items. So that's what's going on there. And in here we can see in our various objects what's included. So we have the URL, this is the avatar, so this is the image that we have, and we can see the link to the URL of that image, the email address of the user, a first name, an ID and a last name. And this is all specified in this host sample API data. So if you were to make your own data, perhaps in a file, you will be sending back different information, or if you were to use another API, they might be sending back different information. So that's all specified in the API request itself. The page that you're requesting this information from will have the data set up in a particular way. This happens to be how the data is set up in this particular API, and that's what we've got back. We have fetched that data from this URL and we can see it here in our console, and we can do things with this data now. So now we have this response data, we could write other functions to do stuff with this data, to parse it, to display it in different areas, to verify that the user is a user, and lots of different things. So first of all, getting the data, and then you can do things with the data. So that's what a fetch statement is. This is a HTTP fetch request, and you can see there it in action. A basic example of how it works and what it's all about. So thanks so much for having a look at the next letters in the alphabet, D, E and F, and I look forward to continuing the alphabet with you. This whole alphabet is included in a book that I have coming out, and I'll give you a rundown in the next video of the entire alphabet and what it is we're going to cover, and I will be adding to this alphabet, but I'll give you a first pass of all of the A to Z, so the first set of letters. And there's more letters to come, so we'll have second examples of the letter A, the letter B, and so on. So you can really build up your coding vocabulary and really get used to the terms and phrases that are used within the coding industry, so you're prepared when someone wants to talk to you about coding and you're not blindsided like I was when I first started in the industry. So getting these terms and terminologies and phrases into your brain is really helpful, because this is the language of coding. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do like and subscribe. I really appreciate it as a content creator, and I wish you all the best of luck in your coding journey. Any comments or questions, do let me know and I'll be sure to clarify or do another video. And have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, and peace guys. Enjoy the week.